Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hey everyone, it's Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast. It's really terrific to have your company for another episode of the show. Now, my guest today is a researcher who really unpicks and untangles all the big questions in life. And what's really interesting about Dr. Adam Fraser is his ability to take complex things and make them simple. And in this podcast, we talk about the value of research in decision making. We talk about some of the dilemmas that you have to encounter on a day-to-day basis when you're in practice, where you've got a situation in front of you and you don't know what decision to make because there is no evidence for this. And then, of course, how to become better leaders as we interact with people as well, and what all the indicators are showing us. Now, Adam, as I said, is a really interesting and fascinating guy. He's got a couple of books out which I'd really commend you to have a look at. The first one is called The Third Space. And what's really interesting, it's about how to use life's transitions to find, balance and happiness in your life and to move through that, of course. And his second book is called Strive, which, as the name suggests, is about embracing struggle and seeing the gifts in that. So I'd really encourage you to head across to dradamfraser.com, have a look around the resources there. There's a ton of really good stuff. But for now, I hope you find this conversation with Adam as fascinating and as interesting as I did when I recorded it with him. Hey, Adam, welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us. How's things in your world?
Yeah, things are good in my world. It's a beautiful day in Sydney. It's almost feeling like summer's in the air, so I'm feeling pretty energized today, actually.
Happy days. I was walking down to the office today, and I'm in Canberra, and I was walking down the road and noticed that the blossoms are out, and the blossoms come out when the promise of warmer weather is just around the corner. So we're all looking forward to that very much indeed. Hey, mate, you've got a really good track record around research, and you've got a lot of really interesting research, particularly in various different disciplines around financial planning and others, about what people are really looking for in the world. And that seems to me like an interesting and an unusual profession to kind of do. How did you find your way into becoming a researcher, and what led you down this type of research? What's the background?
Yeah, well, my undergraduate was biomedical science, which is kind of a blend of psychology and physiology. And, I did quite well in my course. So they offered me a scholarship to do a honours and then offered me a scholarship to do a PhD. And in between some of those, I ran a business for a while, worked at the Institute of Sport for a while. Yeah, so after I finished my PhD, I was lecturing and the uni sent me on a course on how to teach adults. And I went along, and the guy running the course was an amazing keynote speaker. And I just went, in the break, I just said, man, I want to do what you do. Can you teach me how? And he kind of treated me like the Karate Kid for a while just to see if I was serious about this. He actually treated me quite terribly. Then he kind of mentored me and I got into speaking, and where I spend my time is, presenting at conferences, running workshops, doing research with different universities, and then doing like a large scale sort of intervention. For example, we're running something called the Flourish Movement, which is around school leaders. How do they make themselves sustainable? Like, how do they not burn out, but also how do they be effective? How do they get good outcomes? And that's an 18-month program where we do research with Deakin University pre and post, just to ensure that we actually see some genuine change. Yeah, so that's kind of the road that's led me to that. And I spend my time in those three areas.
It's a real intersection, isn't it? Because it sounds like there's this intersection of, research and academic life. Then there's the obviously the application that to real world examples, in your case, business, and then obviously presenting and teaching and being able to transfer that knowledge. It's a really lovely Venn diagram there. I like threes. Three's my magic number, mate.
And look, after I finished my PhD, I literally almost had a breakdown. It was so stressful. And I just went, I'm never doing research again. But as I started to get into presenting, I kind of went, you're either really entertaining, but your knowledge is so thin, or the stuff that underpins what you're saying, there's no evidence for it. So you're either entertaining and like there's not a lot of substance there, or you've got incredible substance, but you bore people crazy.
Yeah.
And I just looked at it and went, oh, can we have the best of both worlds? Can we have that rigor and research, but also at the same time engage people and, it sounds corny, but entertain them as well as, transfer knowledge?
I don't think it's corny at all. I think it's really important, because I think when people are entertained, they're paying attention. And when they're bored out of their brain, their mind is off thinking about a million other things other than what you're talking about. And it reminds me, actually, I've been to, 10 million different dental conferences in the past. And typically at the beginning of some presentation, someone's going to put up a slide that says, I know you can't read this slide, but let me tell you about it. And you go like, if I can't see the data that you're trying to show me, just don't put it on the slide, please. Because, and then you're in for a boring presentation. So I wanted just to talk a bit about the role of research, because I think this is really important. And we're talking just briefly off air about the value of research to underpin conclusions and how a lot of people don't use research. And I guess, I'm curious to understand why the research is missing in so many different elements of life, and, what can be done about that? Where do we fall short?
That's a big question. I think not a lot's done, because it's bloody hard to do, and it takes incredible skill and resources. So we partner with different universities, and why we do that is not only do we get access to their skills, because, you talk about stats. I was talking to someone that does the stats for Deakin University, and I was like, man, I don't even understand half the things you're saying, but I can see that you're getting this outcome and you're taking that part. So we just get access to incredible resources. But also, because we use universities, our evidence is independent. Like, we're not measuring our own outcomes, which is just a ridiculous thing to do, because you're going to be biased. Like, you just can't help it. So the reason we do that is to just ensure that we really are having the impact that we think we're having. We often study a group before we work with them. So a lot of trainers, a lot of programs, they go, I have this program, I'm coming in and I'm doing it to you. What we often do is research the cohort, because some of our assumptions are just way off. For example, we've been studying financial advisors, and what we've been looking at is, how does an industry or a profession that's had so much change imposed on them, how do they innovate and evolve? Like, how do they, because they're sort of similar businesses to a lot of people that are listening to this, where they're smaller businesses, they're specialized, they're very skilled. And we made a heap of assumptions about these financial advisors, but the research showed that we were wrong in so many of them. Like, older financial advisors are engaging in technology as much as young ones. That women coming into the profession are having more success than the men are. Like, it's not that women are trying to keep up with the men. They're actually making the industry far better. Even we were working with some partners in professional services firms, like, your EY, your KPMGs, and we're looking at partner burnout. So the firm said, well, we've got to build up their resilience. And I'm like, well, I think we've got to study them first. And what we found is their resilience scores were off the charts. Like, these people were so tough, but they just never stopped. So they didn't have a resilience problem, they had a recovery problem.
Yeah, okay.
So if we'd have gone in there with our assumptions, we're like, okay, here's how you be more resilient, keep pushing. That was the last thing we should do with them. It was, you've got all this incredible discipline, but you just driving yourself into the ground. That's why we do the research. It just gives us the accuracy. It makes sure we're addressing the problems that are actually there, and it ensures that we are having an impact rather than, we're fudging our numbers to make ourselves look good.
As dentists, we kind of grew up in the era of evidence-based dentistry, and you needed evidence to support all your clinical decisions. And sometimes you're confronted with a clinical situation where there really is no evidence for what you're about to try, but really there's no alternative. Sometimes you're dealing with a really difficult decision and clinical situation. I guess I wanted to ask you how to make peace with decision making in the absence of really good evidence.
I mean, obviously they've got to they've got to evaluate the situation. They've got to be objective, maybe run it by a colleague, run it by someone internally, even run it by someone that doesn't have a lot of knowledge, so you get a different perspective. Jeez, yeah, that's how to have peace in that moment. I don't know. I'm part of me's going, I don't even know.
That's okay. That's okay. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe that is the answer. Maybe we get as many eyes on the situation and we roll with it.
Yeah, when you find yourself in that situation, it's that self-awareness of, why do I want to go down this path, or what's driving it, or getting different perspectives, I think would be a really important one. But as you said, at the end of the day, you're not superhuman. If this is an area that's quite unknown, you don't have a lot of clinical research to fall back on. Yeah, I mean, you've got to go with what you think is best.
Yeah.
I suppose that's one of the biggest challenges of medicine, isn't it?
It really is. And I think, one of the things that we look at, sometimes we see patients come through the door with all manner of different situations and teeth badly broken down and goodness knows what else. And you know that there's no really good, clear option in front of you. And, in some cases, you're just making the least bad choice. And sometimes that's really tough as a healthcare provider, because you're constantly there to do the best you can for your patients. And sometimes you're confronted with these impossible situations where you're going, I don't know that I can do much here that's going to be particularly useful. I want to have a crack and do something. I mean, of course, the first rule is do no harm. We understand that. I'm not talking about being a cowboy or doing anything like that. It's just that if we do nothing, the situation only deteriorates and gets worse. So I think there is something in there for dentists who are dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. Maybe it is get your colleagues in, get a second set of eyes or a third set of eyes on it, and then just do the best you can.
And I think part of that, or a conversation that flows on from that, is that in a way, and this is going to be the wrong language, like this is not going to sound right, but to a degree we have to be detached from the outcome. And, as a clinician, me as an educator, like I used to be just so obsessed that I had to win everyone over.
Yeah.
Or, you'd get 100 pieces of feedback and 99 are so glowing, but one person goes, that was crap, that guy's an idiot, and you'd obsess over that. And I just I would turn myself inside out, particularly with some of our consulting projects where we're trying to really get behaviour change. If people didn't change, it would just distress me so much. I've let them down. I'm not good enough, I'm this, I'm that. And I don't know whether it's you just get older and you have more peace with it, but you've just got to let go of, I can't control them. I can't control the outcome here. And that, part of it is due to their actions and they've put themselves in this situation. So it's that real delicate balancing act of caring, but also at the same time, I'm not in control of this. I've done the best I can. And it was interesting, years ago, we did some research with palliative care nurses. And what we were looking at specifically with them was how do you go home at the end of the day and leave that behind? And what we found is the ones that really sustained that job were very realistic about, I'm there to support and care, but this is not my trauma. And some of them that we worked with children who are in palliative care, which is just soul destroying. One of them I said, how do you cope? And she said, life's not fair. She said, what I had to learn is that many people don't make it to adulthood, and it's sad and horrible, but it's a reality of the world. So I think that almost that capacity to detach in a way, obviously give it our best shot, but at the end of the day, you've kind of gone, well, I've done what I can do, and this is up to the other person to either follow my advice or to regress back into what they were doing.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think to understand that perhaps we didn't cause the problem, we're just there simply as a helper. We didn't make the tooth break down, or we didn't cause someone to get sick or whatever it is. So I think that's probably part of that. I was reading a book by Annie Duke, a lady who wrote a book called Thinking in Vets. She talked about this concept of the probability of something happening versus the likelihood it's going to happen, or the fact that probability doesn't mean it absolutely has to happen. And so what that led me to consider was, how do we understand or reconcile the fact that all the evidence might point to a particular course of action being the best course of action? It's going to work, 85% of the time, 90% of the time, whatever it is. And, when we take that course of action, perhaps in our circumstances, we don't get the outcome that is most likely or probable. We get a different outcome out of the range of possibilities. And I'm just curious to understand how we can, as decision makers in our clinical world or in our business world, how do we find peace again with the fact that, the possibility of something occurring versus the probability of something occurring are not necessarily the same?
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems with, human beings are incredibly complex,
yes.
As well as if you look at research, it's not a perfect thing. We put people through a trial, or we measure outcomes, and it's our kind of best guess of, if we do this, then we'll tend to get this outcome. You can't guarantee that. In those contexts, at each step of the way, particularly when we're dealing with patients, is just ensuring that each decision we make, have we made it in alignment with what we think we stand for? So this is something I see in organizations all the time, is that, everyone has their values up on the wall of, this is what we stand for. Here's the type of organization we want to be, or type of clinician we want to be. So it's very easy to put that stuff up. The hard part is, do our daily decisions, actions, and behavior actually align to what we say we stand for? So what I see in organizations so much is, we talk about, we're all about our people's well-being, yet they work them to death. Or we're all about innovation and trying new things, but when someone makes a mistake, they get punished for it. So as a clinician and a business owner, I think it's consistently asking yourself that question of, am I in alignment with what I say is important to me, or am I in alignment with the evidence? And I think we can't control outcomes, like we just can't. But what we can control is what sits behind the decisions that we make. So to answer that question, my advice would be, am I in alignment to the type of person I want to be? And I say this to leaders all the time, is, whether you're following policy, whether you're following procedure, whether you're doing something to support one of your team members, constantly checking in with yourself of, well, why did I do that? Did I cut a corner because it was convenient for me, or did I make the best decision then? As we're making decisions, ensuring that it's aligned to our values, the evidence, the type of practice we want to have.
So Adam, of course, that's really useful and valuable insight, because what it really highlights is the fact that as leaders, we're going to have blind spots. And the nature of blind spots is we don't see them, but others, will see that as a glaring thing happening. How do we, as leaders, identify or become aware of these blind spots? How do we use maybe research or other perspectives to get clear about things that we might not be seeing clearly ourselves?
Oh, we're getting deep here, aren't we? Okay, so I would say there's two key ways to that. One is just that self-awareness of, and self-awareness is basically just understanding, or identifying our thoughts and emotions that are happening for us, right? So humans are thought to be the only creatures who can have thoughts about their thoughts. Where they're in a meeting and you notice yourself getting angry, or you notice yourself, having a really negative narrative about this staff member or my partner in the business. So that self-awareness to catch yourself and go, you know what, why am I so angry at this right now? So I'm doing a research project, and, there's a big team, and some of the people in the project were just driving me crazy. And, they were slowing things down, holding things back, just talking about tiny little minutiae that did not matter. And I kind of cracked it in this meeting. And I just had to walk away from that experience and go, do you know what? Like, why did that push my buttons so much? And just that self-awareness to go, well, actually, I wasn't mad at them. I was frustrated that I had let them step over my boundaries. Like, so what had happened is for weeks and weeks and weeks, they'd exhibited these behaviors I wasn't happy with. And instead of having the courage and guts to pull them up in the early days, I let it go and I let it build. And the reason I was so mad in that meeting was I was just frustrated at myself. So that self-awareness to go, hey, that wasn't about them, that was about you, and like you're part of the problem as well. So rather than walking away going, oh, these people are idiots and I'm not working with them anymore, I was walking away going, yeah, you're out of line in that meeting, you got to apologize, and here's what was driving you in that moment. So what we know about good leaders, and you look at any leadership model anywhere in the world, self-awareness is always the basic underpinning of any leadership model. Can I understand myself and what drives my behavior? The second one, and this requires humility, is that are we open to people giving us feedback? And this is the whole ball game when it comes to leadership, is setting up a culture within your practice where people can go, hey, with that patient, like you were really curt with them or you're out of line, or with that staff member, hey, you gave them a dressing down in that meeting and you didn't need to do that publicly, and you know, you're going to have to repair that relationship. And one of the challenges for people listening to this is that, you know, you're incredibly bright. Academically, you're incredibly strong. You've often been the smartest person in the room. Your whole life you've been told you're brilliant and you're smart. The challenge is that within that, can you have the humility to go, yeah, I have blind spots, or yeah, I have behaviors that aren't great, or yeah, I can learn from my new staff member who's only been here for 3 months. The best leaders allow that feedback to occur. Having that type of culture in your practice is incredibly important. And even listening to people's ideas. Like where innovation comes from is people with different perspectives to us go, have you ever thought about this? Or here's what I've noticed. I mean, like in my business, I've got people who have got masters, PhDs. The best ideas I'd ever get was a woman that was a marketing manager for a car dealership.
Yeah.
Because I would talk about some complex psychological construct and she'd go, here's my perspective on this. And she would always make me look at it from a whole different lens. So it's two things. Can I develop self-awareness? And that is definitely a skill. And it's just asking yourself, what's going on for me in this moment? Like, why am I having that reaction? Why do I have that story about that person? Is it accurate? And then the second part is who gives me feedback? Because we do have blind spots. So do I set up a culture where I allow people to give me feedback on how I can improve as a leader? Because if we don't get feedback, we're not evolving.
Yeah, 100%. And this kind of ties into, I know, a theme, which is a strong theme that you talk about pretty regularly, which is about human performance and potential and so on and so forth. And to fulfill potential, it's not really an accident, right? There seems to be an intentionality behind that. And I wanted to get your thoughts about potential in ourselves, but also developing potential in others, maybe seeing potential they don't see for themselves even, and what that can mean for an organisation, because I know you've worked with some really large organisations, MLC, University of Queensland, a whole bunch of large organisations. But my hypothesis is for the business to succeed, we've got to become really good at developing people.
Oh, man, totally. God, I spoke at the Australian Hotel Association. These are people that run pubs, right?
Yeah.
So their biggest challenge is their staff is incredibly transient. They find it very hard to find good staff and to hold on to them. And they had a panel after I presented, and there were some young leaders, and God, they were brilliant. And these are very successful businesses that they're running. But it was all about connection with their staff, genuinely caring about them and connecting with them, transparency around decision-making and what's happening in the business. And the last part was that feedback and supporting them and helping them grow and evolve and get better, that kind of skill-based mastery. It was such a strong theme that ran across all these leaders. But yeah, I think, when you were talking about that before, something that jumped into my head was that 10,000 hours piece.
Oh, yeah.
It was based on a research of a guy called Andre Erickson, who looked at deliberate practice. Now, Malcolm Gladwell took his research and misinterpreted it and came up with this thing of it takes 10,000 hours to be world-class. So if you want to be a great violin player, you've got to play for 10,000 hours. Now, if you look at the actual research, it's much more like 30,000, 40,000 hours. But Erickson's big breakthrough and finding was it's not the volume of practice, it's how you practice. And he talked about a thing called deliberate practice, where whenever you're practicing, you're doing something that you find uncomfortable. And so if you look at a great musician, they don't just play the pieces that they know really well. Every time they practice, they try something that they can't quite get. If you're a golfer, you're trying the shots that you find really difficult. So it's looking at, in this practice, what am I working on to ensure that I'm evolving? Annie Duke, you were talking about before, she does a lot of work in sport, doesn't she?
Yeah.
And if you look at great athletes, they're always training on and developing their weaknesses. They're, like every session, it's about, well, what are we focusing on here? How are we going to get better? And, imagine if we took that same discipline and applied it to, our practices of, okay, in terms of how I interact with patients, I'm working on doing this. Having empathy, developing rapport. Obviously the skill side of dentistry and in terms of the medical side, obviously we want to work on that. But also in my leadership, what am I doing? Am I working on my communication style? Am I trying to really develop parts of my team? So I think the problem is that we often look at the leadership and the client experience as well, that's all the soft crap. And, I'm a medical person and that's what I need to work on, rather than looking at all these other things that are going to support our business so much.
The research you've done for one industry, I know it won't necessarily translate across different industries, but what could another industry learn from reading the financial planners' research, for example? What in that might be relevant to other industries, or what could translate? Yeah, even if it's a theme or something that could be not necessarily hard science, but just something along the lines of what inferences, what lessons could be learned from that for dentists or indeed anyone else.
And this is something I see so much of. One of the problems when we exist in a profession like the one you're in is we tend to get very insular, meaning we only look at other dentists or dental practices. So if you look at the Apple Store, which, God, that's been around for a long time, but when that thing came out, people lost their minds.
Yeah, they loved it.
Like it was a retail experience like we'd never seen before. And I think it was Jobs said they modeled it on the Ritz-Carlton. So they went, all right, how does it feel to walk into a really awesome hotel and get an amazing experience? So a technology company is looking at hospitality for inspiration. I haven't kept up with this, but I remember years ago there was a case study of a surgeon called Dr. Devi Shetty. Now, he was a surgeon in Bangalore in India, and he was a cardiothoracic surgeon. And his whole purpose was how do I make cardiothoracic surgery cheaper so we can give it to people who are incredibly poor? And he started to question the model of cardiothoracic surgery. And he went and looked at how Toyota made cars. And he did the tour. I've done that tour. It's just mind-blowing. But he walked out going, oh my gosh, like that's how you run a business. And he turned his hospital into literally a production line where teams have, so what they were able to do is, the amount of surgeries they could do with this new model was mind-blowing, and they started operating on homeless people for free because it was just so scalable. I would say constantly look at different industries, professions. How do they do this? What sort of experience do they give people? And it's just looking at the principles of, well, why does that work? And starting to look at, well, here's the elements and here's what I could take or here's what I could use. Yeah, because we just get far too insular. I was asked by a university recently to come in and present to the most senior people in that university. And, I presented and another guy presented, and the feedback was, the presentations are great, but moving forward, they only want to hear from people who work in the industry, in the university. And I'm like, they're the last people they should be listening to because they're around them all the time. So I getting very diverse and different perspectives and not having that arrogance or contempt of what could I possibly learn for you. So, that real openness and curiosity, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and actually, it's really interesting. I haven't even had the chance to disclose this little fun fact for you, Adam, and that is our whole ethos at Savvy Dentist is not invented here. So the idea of looking over the fence into other people's backyards, into other industries, is really at the heart of what we do. And interestingly, just while you're talking about production lines, I don't know if you ever saw it, just a fun little doco, if you get the chance to see it. There's a documentary about the history of Motown music, which came out of Detroit. And the founder, Berry Gordy, used to work on the Ford production line. So what happened is they had this artist development program, and they'd take them around the Motown production line, based off Ford as well, similar concept, and they'd take them through singing lessons, styling, dance lessons, PR, all those sorts of things. And they had their artist development program run like the Ford factory line. So again, I think there's a lot in there.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah, it's really clever. And I think what's interesting around that is how you take almost anything from anywhere, and there's always a use for it, right? And I think that's actually innovation is not necessarily always creating something new, but it's how can you repurpose something in a new way.
And even that different perspective. So for 6 years, I mean, you understand this. It takes a very long time for new research to actually enter the market.
Yeah.
Academic research is going in a certain direction, and the average person doesn't find out about that for like 10, 15 years. So there's been a huge shift in psychology away from, if I have negative thoughts and emotions, they're bad, I have to fight them. So if I'm about to do a podcast with you and I have imposter syndrome thoughts, I'm supposed to go, no, I've got a PhD. I've been doing this for 25 years. I know what I'm talking, and we fight our thoughts. And what psychology is moving towards is a model around flexibility, so psychological flexibility. So how can I have fear and doubt but still do the right behavior? So psychology's gone through this massive transformation, and I've been trying to teach this to normal people. When I say normal, meaning not in that psychology realm, for 7 years. And it's just so complex, and the constructs are so counterintuitive. I was struggling. And one day I said to my 8-year-old, I said, hey, can I explain something to you? And can you tell me what you remember? So anyway, I write this thing out and I explain this whole concept to her. And I said, how could I make this simpler for people to understand? And she goes, well, Dad, if you change the order of what you're teaching, and if you look at the first letter of each sentence, it spells the word safe. And what you're trying to do is make people safe with their uncomfortable thoughts and emotions. So if you just change the order, it's going to spell the word safe. And I was just like, are you freaking kidding me?
That's cool.
For 7 years, I've been battling with this, because actually this is something that the people listening would struggle with. How do you change hats? How do you put your clinician hat off and then take it off and become a leader? And I have to have a hard conversation with my staff, or I have to put the accountant's hat on and make a strategic perspective. I find it really hard to shift gears like that. And whenever I would get into this stuff, PhD Adam would come out. So I would start to make it overly complex. And my daughter just guided me in this beautiful way. And as soon as I changed it, people went, oh my gosh, that's so interesting, and I get that and I can use it. But yeah, I think it comes back to that humility of, What could an 8-year-old possibly teach me? Well, apparently a lot.
Quite a lot. I reckon there's a lot more than that too. I'm just going to point out, I think kids have a great way of teaching their parents, probably more than parents teach their kids on some occasions. I know in my family that's been true anyway. My kids teach me a lot.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
Yeah. Adam, firstly, thanks so much for being a wonderful guest on the program. It's really interesting and fascinating to talk to you, because one of the things that I always have felt and believed is that good data, good science, really underpins good decision making. And I think the work that you do and the inferences you can derive from it, I do think that they are cross-relevant. And I think that there's a lot of things that we can learn from people like financial planners. And so I just want to say thanks for all the work that you do. Thanks for all the research you're putting out there, because it does give all of us insight into what's happening. And I think there's lessons there for us all. So from all of us here at the podcast, mate, I just want to say thanks for being such a fun guest, and I appreciate your time.
Pleasure. It was great. And thanks for asking some of the hardest questions I've ever got.
Yes, sorry about that. Questions without notice. Sorry, mate. My apologies. Good fun. All right, mate. Well, thank you once again, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast. For more episodes, go to drjessiegreen.com/savvydentist. And to discover how to build a high-performance dental practice, visit drjessiegreen.com and download the free report.